May 10, 1940. 5:35 hours. The Ardennes forest. Darkness still held in the valleys. No moon. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Then, from the east, a sound, low at first, a mechanical rumble that grew until it filled the entire forest. The ground began to vibrate. By 5:40, the sky was alight, not with dawn. With fire, I begin here because this moment, this specific crossing of the Meuse River through terrain the French High Command had deemed impassable for armor represents the purest expression of a military doctrine that would reshape warfare. Itself, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The term would become shorthand for German military success between 1939 and 1941. But the reality was far more complex, more deliberate, and more fragile than mythology suggests. What unfolded in those 72 hours in May 1940 was not magic. It was not superior courage. It was the ruthless application of integrated combined arms tactics, executed with precision against an opponent who still thought in terms of the previous war, but I am getting ahead of the story. To understand Blitzkrieg, one must first understand what it was not. It was not a formal German military doctrine. The word itself appears nowhere in Wehrmacht operational manuals of the period. German officers spoke instead of Begegungskriegemobil, Warführer, more precisely, Auftragstaktik mission-type tactics that emphasized decentralized decision-making and rapid exploitation of enemy weakness. The theoretical foundations were laid in the years following Germany's defeat in 1918. Officers like Heinz Guderian studied the British use of tanks at Cambrai in 1917. They analyzed JFC Fuller's writings on armored warfare. They watched Soviet experiments with deep operations theory. Most importantly, they understood that the machine gun and the trench had made frontal assault obsolete. Any future war would have to be won through movement, not attrition. By 1935, Guderian was commanding Germany's 1st Panzer Division. The concept was simple in theory. Revolutionary in practice, concentrate armor into independent formations, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled artillery, coordinated with close air support, all moving at speed to penetrate enemy lines and drive deep into rear areas, collapsing command structures and supply networks before the enemy could react. The critical word, speed, not just the speed of individual tanks or aircraft, but the speed of the speed of information flow, the speed at which advantages could be pressed before the enemy recovered. That this required rethinking everything: communications, logistics, command hierarchy, even the basic tactical unit. September 1st, 1939. For 45 hours, Poland, the town of Wielu, population 16,000, the Luftwaffe attacked first. 3 waves of Junkers, Ru-87 Stuka dive bombers. No military targets of significance. The objective was psychological: to shatter civilian morale, block roads with rubble, create chaos that would impede Polish military mobilization. 75% of the town was destroyed. Over 1,200 civilians killed. 5 minutes later, German artillery opened fire along the entire border. At 5 o'clock, panzer columns crossed into Poland from East Prussia, Silesia, and Slovakia simultaneously. 53 divisions, 2,000 tanks, over E-10 Bomber aircraft. The Polish army had anticipated invasion, but not the sheer speed and coordination of the assault. Within 6 hours, German armored spearheads had penetrated 20 miles into Polish territory. The Polish defensive strategy, which relied on linear defense along the frontier, began to collapse. Polish command and control, dependent on telegraph lines and dispatch riders, could not match the pace of German radio-equipped tank formations. I note the technology here deliberately. Every German tank commander had a radio. This was not standard in other armies. French tanks, for instance, relied on flag signals between vehicles. The implications were profound. A German panzer company could coordinate maneuvers in respond to threats instantly, concentrate force at decisive points within minutes. The Polish campaign lasted 36 days, but the operational pattern was established in the first 72 hours. Luftwaffe strikes destroyed Polish airfields and communications centers. Panzer divisions bypassed fortified positions, driving for depth. Infantry divisions followed, encircling and reducing bypass strongpoints. The result, double envelopments on a massive scale. The Poznań Pocket, the Radom Pocket, the Buzura Pocket. 120,000 Polish troops surrendered at Buzura alone. The world noticed, but few understood. The mechanics of Blitzkrieg were built on three integrated components: Schwerpunkt, Auftragstaktik, and Kesselschlacht, Schwerpunkt, Tetha, focal point of effort. All resources concentrated at a single decisive location to achieve breakthrough, not broad front advancement, but a narrow penetration with overwhelming local superiority. This was the opposite of First World War thinking, which emphasized equal distribution of forces along defensive lines. Auftragstaktik mission command. Senior officers provided objectives, not methods. Junior officers were expected to use initiative to exploit opportunities without waiting for permission. This required extensive training, mutual trust, and a shared operational philosophy. It also required accepting risk. Some commanders would fail, but the successful ones would achieve results impossible under rigid hierarchical control. Kesselschlacht cauldron, not just defeating the enemy army, but destroying it. Panzer forces would penetrate deep, then wheel to create pockets. Infantry divisions would form the outer ring. Artillery and air power would prevent breakout. The trapped forces would be systematically eliminated or forced to surrender. These were not new concepts. Cannae, in 216 BC, demonstrated in Napoleon's campaigns showed the power of concentrated force, but the combination of mechanization, radio communication, and tactical air support created something qualitatively different. The time and space compression was unprecedented. Consider the numbers. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Prussian cavalry could advance perhaps 30 miles in a day under ideal conditions. A panzer division in 1940 could sustain 50 miles per day for multiple days. With combat capability intact, the operational tempo increased by an order of magnitude. This created what military theorists call the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The side that completed this cycle faster gained cumulative advantage. German forces, with superior communications and decentralized command, completed their loop in hours. Allied forces, with centralized command and slower communications, needed days. The gap was lethal. May 13, 1940. 16 o'clock. Sedan, the Meuse River. 19 Panzer Corps under General Guderian had crossed the Ardennes and reached the river in 3 days 72 hours ahead of French projections. The opposite bank was held by the French 55th Infantry Division, a second-rate formation composed largely of reservists over 30 years old. The crossing should have been impossible. The Meuse at Sedan was 60 meters wide. The western bank rose steeply ideal defensive terrain. French bunkers and artillery positions covered every approach, but Guderian had concentrated 1,500 artillery pieces and 1,000 aircraft in a 5-kilometer sector. This represented firepower density unprecedented in military history up to that point. At 16 o'clock, the bombardment began. Not random strikes. Coordinated suppression. Bunker embrasures. Communication trenches. Artillery batteries. The objective was not complete destruction. That was impossible, but sustained psychological pressure that prevented effective response. The Stuka was particularly important here. The Junkers Ru 87 was slow, vulnerable, essentially obsolete by 1940 standards. But it could deliver bombs with remarkable precision, and it created terror. The Sirens Jericho Trompeton were designed specifically for psychological effect. Each dive produced a screaming wail that could be heard for miles. French soldiers in the bunkers could not return fire effectively. They could not communicate with higher command. They could not see through the dust and smoke. They could not think clearly under that sustained assault. At 20 o'clock, German combat engineers launched rubber boats across the river. The first wave was slaughtered. Survivors made it across. They established a narrow foothold on the western bank. The second wave followed, then the third. By midnight, a bridgehead existed. Engineers began constructing pontoon bridges under darkness and residual artillery fire. By dawn on May 14th, German tanks were crossing the Meuse. The French 55th Division had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. Total casualties, approximately 7,500 men. German casualties in the crossing, fewer than 500. This was not a battle. It was systematic demolition of a defensive position through concentration of force and integration of arms. The exploitation phase began immediately. Traditional military doctrine suggested consolidation. Establish defensive positions around the bridgehead. Wait for infantry support. Build up supplies, then advance methodically. Guderian ignored doctrine by 5 o'clock on May 14th. German panzer battalions were already 5 miles beyond the Meuse, driving west at maximum speed. By noon, 10 miles. By midnight, 25 miles. The French had reserves. The 1st Armored Division, for instance, was nearby. But it took time to mobilize, time to receive orders, time to deploy. The division spent May 14th preparing to move. On May 15th, it advanced toward the breakthrough. By then, German forces had penetrated 40 miles, and the 1st Armored found itself attacking an enemy that no longer existed at that location. This was the essence of Blitzkrieg. Moving inside the enemy's decision cycle, creating situations faster than the enemy could respond to them. The human cost was extraordinary, but not in combat casualties. German panzer crews were operating at the edge of endurance, 18-hour days in cramped tank interiors. Limited food, minimal sleep, constant vibration, noise, diesel fumes. The machines were breaking down, track links failing, engines overheating, gun mechanisms jamming. Supply columns were stretched across hundreds of miles of road, vulnerable to counterattack. Guderian's superiors ordered him to halt, consolidate, wait for infantry. Guderian ignored them. He understood that momentum was everything. Once lost, it could not be regained. The enemy was reeling. Now was the moment to drive deeper, to expand the breakthrough before resistance could form. By May 20th, German armor reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They had advanced 250 miles in 10 days. The Allied armies in Belgium were cut off from France. The strategic situation was irreversible. I pause here to address mythology. Blitzkrieg was not invincible. It was not perfect. It succeeded in Poland and France because specific conditions aligned, terrain favorable to armor. Whether that permitted air operations, an enemy wedded to defensive doctrine and rigid command structures. The limitations became apparent almost immediately. At Arras on May 21st, a British counterattack with 74 tanks created panic in German ranks. The Matilda II tanks had armor thick enough to shrug off German 37mm anti-tank guns. Several panzer divisions were temporarily stopped. Rommel himself, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, had to employ 88mm anti-aircraft guns in direct fire role to stop the British armor. This revealed fundamental weakness. German tanks in 1940 were not superior machines. The Panzer II was armed with a 20mm cannon adequate for reconnaissance, useless against armored targets. The Panzer III had a 37mm gun that could not penetrate heavy armor. Only the Panzer IV, with its 75mm gun, had serious anti-armor capability, and these represented a small fraction of the force. German success depended on combined arms coordination, not superior equipment. When that coordination broke down, when infantry couldn't keep pace with armor, when air support was grounded by weather, when supply lines were severed, the entire system became vulnerable. France fell not because of wonder weapons, but because French command structure could not adapt to the operational tempo. French tanks were often superior to German tanks. French artillery was excellent. French fortifications were formidable. But French doctrine emphasized methodical, centralized control. Radio communications were inadequate. Command decisions required approval from multiple levels of hierarchy. The result, while German commanders were making decisions in hours, French commanders needed days. In war, days might as well be months. June 22, 1941, 03:15 hours, Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German troops, 600 tanks, 700 aircraft. Objectives: destroy the Red Army in western Russia, seize Moscow before winter, secure Caucasus oil fields. The operational plan followed the Blitzkrieg template. 3 army groups advancing simultaneously on broad fronts, panzer spearheads encircling Soviet formations, infantry following to reduce pockets. The geography was different, vast plains instead of French countryside, but the methodology was identical. Initial success was spectacular. By July 10th, Army Group Center had advanced 450 miles. The Minsk pocket yielded 300 Zalozhin prisoners. The Smolensk pocket yielded another 300 Zalozhin. Soviet command and control collapsed. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. But the scale was wrong. France was 213,000 square miles. Western Russia exceeded 500,000 square miles. The distances were absurd. A panzer division that advanced 50 miles per day would take 30 days to reach Moscow from the border. Assuming perfect conditions, no combat, no mechanical breakdown. Perfect conditions did not exist. Russian roads were primitive. Paved highways essentially didn't exist outside major cities. The Rasputitsa, seasonal mud, turned roads into impassable swamps. German trucks, designed for European roads, broke down constantly. Horses. Yes, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses for logistics. Could not maintain the pace. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. A panzer division consumed approximately 30,000 gallons of fuel per day. Moving fuel forward hundreds of miles while simultaneously advancing required logistics capacity the Germans simply didn't have. And the enemy kept fighting. This was the critical difference. Polish and French armies, once their command structures collapsed, surrendered. Soviet forces, even when surrounded, continued resistance, bypassed pockets tied down German infantry divisions. The rapid advance created a front hundreds of miles long with minimal depth. Operationally brilliant, strategically vulnerable. By December 1941, German forces were outside Moscow. But they were exhausted. Fuel stocks were depleted. Winter clothing was inadequate. Vehicles were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The Blitzkrieg had run out of distance. I examine the failure, not to diminish the earlier successes, but to understand the doctrine's inherent limitations. Blitzkrieg was designed for operational victory, destroying enemy armies in the field through maneuver. It was not designed for strategic campaigns, requiring sustained industrial mobilization, extended logistics, or multi-year attrition. The assumptions were wars could be won in weeks or months. Enemy forces would collapse psychologically once their lines were penetrated. Superior operational skill could compensate for inferior resources. These assumptions held in Poland. They held in France. They held in Yugoslavia and Greece. They failed in Russia. The Soviet Union had strategic depth. It had replacement capacity. Most importantly, it had the political will to continue fighting despite catastrophic losses. German forces destroyed 150 Soviet divisions by September 1941. The Soviets raised 300 new divisions. Blitzkrieg had no answer to this. The Wehrmacht continued using mobile warfare tactics throughout the war. The counterattack at Kharkov in 1943 showed German operational skill remained formidable. But the strategic context had changed. Germany was fighting for survival, not conquest. The battles were defensive, not offensive. The objectives were to buy time, not achieve victory. This was not the war Blitzkrieg was designed to fight. The technical evolution deserves consideration. By 1943, German armor was qualitatively superior to earlier models. The Panther tank had thick sloped armor and a powerful 75 mm gun. The Tiger I was nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons. But these machines were complex, expensive, produced in limited numbers. Germany built approximately 6,000 Panthers and 350 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviet Union built over 57,000 T-34 tanks. The United States built over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Operational brilliance could not overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage in materiel. Allied forces learned. They developed tactics to counter German mobile warfare, deep defensive positions, anti-tank guns in depth, massive artillery support, overwhelming air superiority. By 1944, Allied doctrine emphasized methodical advance with consolidated logistics, exactly the approach that had failed France in 1940. But now the Allies had the industrial capacity to sustain it. Normandy, 1944. The Allies landed with complete air superiority, naval gunfire support, and logistics capacity that could put 2.5 million tons of supplies ashore in 3 months. German panzer divisions attempting the classic Blitzkrieg counterattack were stopped by Allied fighter bombers before they could concentrate. The operational environment had changed. Blitzkrieg required freedom of movement. Allied air power denied that freedom. May 8, 1945, 23:01 hours. Germany surrendered unconditionally. 12 years after the 1st Panzer Division's form. 6 years after Poland. 5 years after France. The historical verdict on Blitzkrieg requires precision. As operational doctrine, it was revolutionary. The integration of armor, mechanized infantry, artillery, and close air support under unified command, employing decentralized tactics to achieve rapid penetration and encirclement. This represented genuine innovation in military art. The campaigns of 1939-1941 demonstrated its effectiveness under favorable conditions, limited geographic scope, qualitatively inferior opponents, political will to accept risk. The campaigns of 1941-1945 demonstrated its limitations, extended operations across vast distances, opponents with superior industrial capacity, strategic objectives beyond operational reach. Blitzkrieg influenced all subsequent military doctrine. Soviet deep operations theory incorporated elements. American airland battle doctrine emphasized similar principles of maneuver and combined arms. Modern mechanized warfare still focuses on rapid penetration, exploitation, and encirclement. But the specific circumstances that enabled German success in 1940 were unique to that moment. An enemy whose doctrine was obsolete, an army willing to accept enormous risk, a political leadership that mistook operational victory for strategic success. The mythology that emerged, that Blitzkrieg was unstoppable, that it represented military genius without precedent, was always false. What it represented was competent application of combined arms doctrine by well-trained forces against poorly prepared opponents. When the opponents adapted, when resources became unbalanced, when the geography expanded beyond sustainable logistics, the doctrine failed. I return, finally, to that morning in May 1940. The Ardennes crossing, the breakthrough at Sedan. In isolation, it was a masterpiece of operational art. The concentration of force, the timing, the exploitation, all executed with precision. Thousands of individual decisions by junior officers, synchronized without central control, achieving results that altered the strategic balance of power in Europe. The soldiers who fought there, German, French, British, were human. They felt fear. They experienced exhaustion. They made mistakes. Some showed extraordinary courage. Others broke under pressure. The machinery was fallible. Tanks broke down. Aircraft crashed. Radio communications failed at critical moments. Success was never inevitable. At a dozen points, the campaign could have failed if French intelligence had correctly assessed the Ardennes route, if reserves had been positioned differently, if weather had grounded the Luftwaffe, if British intervention had been more rapid. But it didn't fail. And because it succeeded, the course of the war, the course of history, changed. 150,000 French soldiers died in 6 weeks. Nearly 2 million became prisoners. An entire nation fell. The psychological impact shaped a generation. This is what Blitzkrieg was, not a wonder weapon or mystical force, but the ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness through concentration of mechanized power and decentralized command. It worked spectacularly when conditions aligned. It failed catastrophically when they didn't. The lessons remain relevant. Speed matters. Initiative matters. Integration of technology and tactics matters. But so does strategic context, industrial capacity, political will, geographic reality. Wars are not won by tactics alone. The Germans learned this. The world learned this. The price of the lesson was 50 million dead. Silence. The engines have stopped. The guns are cold. The archives remain. I study them still. The operational reports, the tactical assessments, the first-hand accounts. Not to glorify, not to condemn, but to understand. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Precise, devastating, revolutionary, and ultimately insufficient. The documents are clear. The evidence is unambiguous. History, as always, is written in the consequences.